On this is the meter taxi model, particularly the ranking model, is one where essentially the driver has a long wait for work, but then potentially a long journey as a result of it with a high fare. So in that model, and it's for Santaco and for the meter taxi associations to provide you with this data, but in that model, typically a driver would do a small number of journeys in a day, but those small number of journeys would be quite high earning. Our model, or our technology platform, provides for the opposite, which is a large number of relatively short-run journeys of reasonable intra-urban, short-distance journeys, earning a moderate fare for each journey, but doing an awful lot more of those journeys. So I'd come back to my colleague invoking the South African Competition Act in the context of efficiency. I'd question whether meter taxi fulfills that objective by having dozens, hundreds of vehicles sitting empty waiting for their turn to work comes up, rather than a technology platform that enables thousands, potentially tens of thousands of vehicles to work pretty much continuously. Certainly from a transport efficiency standpoint, we would suggest that that fills the objectives of the Act.
Okay. If I may add to that, I understand what you're saying about the similarities. So in order to address the similarities, yes, there are similarities in that there are fleets involved. There is a fleet of vehicles that metered taxis use, in the same way there are fleets of vehicles that access riders through the Taxify platform. And so the business then sought to find the largest fleet with the least amount of work. And so those fleets, which would then be able to access different clients and different clientele. So yes, e-hailing enables drivers to have a lot more trips, and as a result of that higher utilization rate, charge lower prices, which ultimately is to the benefit of the consumers, those lower prices. So what would be great to see is if we heard in the previous presentation that the bars are NLTA tries to level the bars by limiting e-hailing to those privileges afforded to metered taxis. Our contention is that this isn't in the best interest of the consumer. What would be better is perhaps there could be afforded the opportunity for metered cabs to provide a similar kind of service, or the demand service, where consumers clearly, that's what they want. From listening to the representations and the submissions of the metered cabs, they say they're going out of business. So if consumers then are saying this is what they're looking for, our contention would then be, well, government, please make a way for these metered cabs to be able to operate. Maybe there's some sort of recapitalization program. Maybe there's a way that they are able to finance vehicles to be able to access riders through the Taxify platform.
If I could just come in on that point, what my colleague describes as recapitalization, I understand as a scrappage scheme. Look, I'm going to be very candid with you, and please forgive somebody who's flown in from London offering views about the quality of the South African taxi system. But the reality is the vehicles that are plying for hire, that are doing meter taxi work in South Africa, are older than you might find in comparably sized economies. The reality is that driving a taxi has always been a tough business, and that consequently that leads to the eking out of efficiencies wherever they can be found. What Gareth describes as a scrappage or as a recapitalisation, in London, Transport for London and the UK government implemented a programme in which drivers of aged vehicles could surrender that vehicle to a public authority in return for a grant or a subsidy for the procurement of a new, cleaner vehicle. Now, obviously, in the context of the UK, that was primarily in the context of pollution, because obviously London is much more polluted than Johannesburg. But consequently, I suspect that from that programme, there may be lessons that could be learned for South African DOT, potentially even competition elements that can be gleaned from such.
In terms of, sorry, just to follow up on this. In terms of meter taxi services, I think if you look at Cape Town has system is more organized in comparison to, say, Johannesburg. Would your views regarding, based on how you've described the state of meter taxi services, would you hold the same views if you were to look at the meter taxi operations in the Western Cape, in Cape Town in particular?
With your permission, I'd prefer not to go much further down the rabbit hole of taking a view about the business of meter taxis. I think it's for them to speak to their segment of the market. We're really here to provide assistance to the Commission on the e-hailing market segment. I feel like I've probably ventured a little further than I should into licensed taxi, but it felt like it would be of assistance.
Well, I'm asking you this question because you seem to suggest that actually it's your contention that you're not you operate in different markets. So, and this is a follow-up to actually your assertion in terms of how you described the meter taxi services.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, if I may. The clients and consumers of the Taxify app, what they're looking for are convenient, affordable, efficient trips from one space to another. And it is what they have become accustomed to, whether it be from their home, whether it be from the shops, wherever it may be, that they know that within the cities that Taxify is available, they can get a vehicle within a few minutes. That is the service that they enjoy. Now, coming out of a shopping center or coming from a restaurant, there is then a habit of, because they are loyal customers, that is the service that they choose. Anecdotally, from my friends, that is the experience, and that's what they choose to enjoy. Now, there are instances where there are ranks at some of those spaces, and where there are some of those ranks, yes, I mean, there is an overlap between the two. However, in the same way, there is also an overlap between taxis and trains and buses, where there is space for all modes of transport within the entire ecosystem, even when there is overlap between those modes of transport.
It sounds to me awfully like it's a case that the MREs in Cape Town are doing rather better in terms of where they're situating their ranks. But, I mean, the reality is it's still, a 9-month wait for the issue of a license in Cape Town. So let's not fall over ourselves to congratulate that MRE too much, but they're clearly doing a better job with meter cabs than we feel like they're doing with our sector. That said, we feel this is a soluble problem, and we're confident that it will be.
Thank you, Chair. Just one question on my side. And this is the question that we're grappling with, as the inquiry, and this is the question which was posed to us, during the submissions that we've had previously. And maybe let me put it like this. Before we talk about and criticize the quality of meter taxi services, before we criticize the ranking systems, before we talk about the benefits that e-hailing services has to consumers, and before we talk about the special privileges that you advance that the meter taxis have, and before we talk about the benefits of the surge pricing and all of those things, which are all good, and don't get me wrong, which are all good, the question that we're grappling with, and the question that has been posed to us, and the question that you've not addressed, is whether it is legally and morally okay for an entity to earn profits and compete with a regulated entity. The problem here, it is not that any of these things that you're proposing are bad. The question is, there's an entity, there are people who are being regulated in terms of the laws of the country. And there comes an entity which is not being regulated, and it earns profit, and it competes against a regulated entity. That is the question that is not being addressed. So the question here is, before we talk about any of these quality issues, criticize the meter taxis, because they're saying to us, well, bring all of those things that you're talking about, but the first thing that you need to do, get yourself properly regulated in terms of the rules and the laws of South Africa. That is the question. And then we'll then talk about any of the special privileges and any of the benefits that comes with e-hailing.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may, the first one there, this stems from the assumption that those leveling this issue all comply. We've seen from the last week, the Gauteng Provincial Legislature, that only 2,500 operating licenses have been issued in the whole of Gauteng. And they cite oversaturation as a result of this. The assumption here by those leveling those claims is that they comply. Our contention is if you have a look at the vehicles and the supply of the vehicles and you have a look at the operating licenses, the numbers seem to dispute that. Which we would then say is, well, yes, let all parties be held to the same account then, because what seems here is that one side is saying, hang on, this isn't happening, but then expects it not to be applicable to them. That is the one contention. The other is that we have been running towards legislation. We have been collaborating and cooperating with the municipalities, the PREs, the legislatures. We've done whatever we can. We've been running towards this regulation. We want to comply. But because of practice notes that at times seem to be against what other findings are, whether maybe it's an operating license, no, it needs to be the charter permit, no, there is oversaturation, no, there is a moratorium. These have prevented many of these operators from being able to obtain those operating licenses. So that's the one side that we contend. The other side is then coming back to, with regards to the Competition Act itself, is to say, let us ensure that there are competitive prices for consumers, and that it seems like there are issues that are preventing competitors. We spoke about surge pricing. If all of these vehicles that didn't obtain operating licenses were to be taken off straight away, everywhere would have surge pricing. And there would be a large number of individuals who would not be able to enjoy the service as a result either.
I think, Chair, maybe to clarify, the question here is, there was a decision in the Western Cape, and that decision was very clear, even though it was opposed by the meter taxi industry, but then what the TAT said is that e-hailing services can make use of the current regulatory framework in order for them to apply for operating licenses. What I'm not hearing from you is whether or not Taxify has adopted the same route. We've heard from Uber, and they say they have. So what I'm not hearing from Taxify is whether or not that process has been engaged upon and it is being met with various, regulatory issues, delays, the system is not working, there's a backlog. I'm not hearing you say that. What I'm saying is, what we've heard from the industry, the meter taxi industry, is that they are regulated, and there's an entity that is not being regulated, and they are being forced to compete with that entity that is not being regulated. They want to compete with an entity that is regulated with all the benefits that you mentioned. They're not afraid of that, but get yourself regulated first so that the playing fields are leveled. That is what they are saying.
Okay. Before you respond, I would also just want to add that perhaps in your response, give us your recommendations in terms of what would work, specifically given the challenges that we have in terms of the issuing of operating licenses. So what is it that you could do regardless in order to comply with legislation?
So in order to speak to that, Mr. Chair, we have met with the MEC for Roads and Transport in Gauteng. We have met with PRE. We have met with various different parties, both municipal and at the provincial level, and have received commitment to grant operating licenses to drivers who utilize the platform. However, the feedback that we are continuing to receive from drivers who are applying is that these licenses have a huge delay, one, or are not being granted?
If I can offer you reassurance on that point, we've strained every sinew to comply with South Africa's regulatory framework, and my colleague has given you fine detail to that effect. The reality is NLTA 2009 is an act that's been overtaken by the development of technology, and it's the phrase hammering a square peg into a round hole has been used. It's quite difficult to attempt to sort of regulate an e-hailing service as though it's a taxi service, because they're different things that behave in different ways. On your point about have you tried to get regulated, yes, absolutely. And there's an expectation in driver onboarding that drivers either have a license or they're in the process, or they've met all of the criteria and they're in the pipeline for doing it. So make no mistake, we've engaged with PREs in every place in which we operate, and the reality is that there is a log jam in the system. So the absence of compliance is not by any absence of willingness on our part, but rather a sort of inability for the either MREs or the PREs to actually be able to, if you'll forgive the metaphor, put rubber on the road. But your overarching point about are you a good corporate citizen? Are you acting in a respectful way to the country in which you are operating and in which your drivers are earning a living and providing for those families? I can't emphasize enough that the answer to that question is yes. This is something we take very seriously.
Maybe just one last point, Chair. I think maybe on a confidential basis, I think the request that we're going to extend, and it's the same request that we extended to Uber, do an audit, and this is just a request on my part, do an audit, give us an indication of the numbers that you have, and give us the numbers in terms of who, from the partner drivers that you have, give us an indication of the number of those that are currently in possession of and operating in terms of the current regulatory framework, and then indicate the rest.
Absolutely.
I understand them to be transport service providers from a Taxify perspective.
Yeah.
Or is there any difference? Because Uber uses the terminology of partner drivers, and you use it. Is it just a semantic issue, or is there something
It's pure semantics.
qualitative in terms
It's pure semantics.
All right.
Look, but to the straight question that was put to me, yes, obviously we've lodged a CC7 with the Commission. Obviously the request falls under the ambit of commercial confidentiality. We're happy to give you that information. We'll need to negotiate a bit about things like collateral use and stuff, but it's not a problem to provide you with that information.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I think an additional aspect, we debated this with Uber. There's this additional regulatory aspect, which is self-regulation, because that is one of the complaints from the meter taxi industry, and you heard the responses from Uber. We just want to get your view on this.
If I may, I'll tell you the very briefest of stories, but when I was working for Uber, I met the German Federal Transport Minister and sang the song about deregulation. And her face went whiter and whiter, and she turned to me and she went, "Mr. Moxentrich, this will never fly in Germany because we take the view that self-regulation is no regulation." And this was an experience that made a very great impression on me. As my colleague has said earlier, look, we're running towards regulation, not away from it. I don't think you'll hear us argue for fundamental deregulation of the industry. We support the idea that platforms such as ours should be regulated, and we support the contention that all of our drivers should be regulated. And we are about to meet DOT to have a conversation to that effect. Are we calling for self-regulation? No. Are we calling for proportionate regulation? Yes, absolutely.
Taylor, I don't know whether there are any additional points you wish to cover.
There's nothing further. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions from the panel? Yeah, I think the last remaining issue is the one that has been raised confidentially. But otherwise, thank you very much for coming here and for a very detailed presentation and for making the time. Thank you very much. Yeah, we will adjourn for the day and resume tomorrow at 9 o'clock sharp. Thank you very much for your attendance.